July 1st, 2025, Canada Day, brought a shock no one expected. The Canadian government announced the closure of key land routes to Alaska, cutting off the US from its own state. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a declaration. The world's longest undefended border suddenly had a new, invisible wall. News spread rapidly, leaving US officials scrambling for answers. The Canadian Prime Minister's office confirmed access was restricted, effective immediately. Former President Trump, vacationing in Florida, reacted with disbelief and anger, calling it a betrayal. The US-Canada relationship had always been defined by partnership, trade, defense, culture, and millions of annual crossings. The idea that Canada would unilaterally sever the vital artery to Alaska was almost unthinkable. It challenged every assumption about North American stability. The world watched, stunned, asking, why would Canada risk a diplomatic crisis with its closest ally? The reasons were complex, rooted in local disputes, environmental concerns, and a surge of Canadian nationalism. What began as a small-town fight spiraled into an international incident. Canada, it seemed, had decided to draw a line in the sand, or across the Alaska Highway. The friendly giant to the north had finally decided to roar. The move was swift, decisive, and bewildering for many. It was a story of sovereignty and respect. The US was left to grapple with a new reality. The border, once a symbol of peace, had become a flashpoint. To grasp the crisis, look at a map. Alaska is an American exclave, separated from the lower 48 by Canada. Its only land connection to the US runs through Canadian territory. The Alaska Highway, built during World War II, became the main artery for commerce and travel. Every day, trucks haul goods, families relocate, and tourists journey north along this route. Without it, Alaska is effectively an island reachable only by sea or air, both costly and slow. For Alaskans, affordable supplies and travel depend on this land link. The arrangement was based on mutual respect. The US honored Canadian sovereignty, and Canada kept the corridor open. Treaties and decades of cooperation made this possible. The idea that Canada would ever use this leverage was once unthinkable, but now the lifeline was threatened. Air and sea routes can't match the efficiency or affordability of the highway. Their closure exposed Alaska's vulnerability and dependence on Canadian goodwill. It was a diplomatic nuclear option, shattering the foundation of partnership. The border, once a model of cooperation, had become a point of contention. The US faced the reality of being cut off from its largest state. The crisis forced both nations to reconsider their assumptions. Geography, once a bridge, had become a barrier. The stakes had never been higher. Every conflict has a flashpoint. For this crisis, it was a dispute between Stewart, British Columbia, and Hyder, Alaska. Hyder, a tiny Alaskan town, is only accessible by road through Stewart and relies on its Canadian neighbor for daily life. Trouble began when a US company planned to restart a mine near Hyder, promising jobs but threatening the Unuk River, which flows into Canada. Canadian environmental groups and First Nations feared pollution would devastate salmon and local ecosystems. Canada requested a joint environmental review, citing treaties on shared waterways. The US, under pressure from mining interests, refused, insisting on its own regulations. Canadians saw this as arrogant and dismissive. Protests erupted in Stewart, blocking access to the mine. The US company complained to Washington. Canada felt its sovereignty was ignored. The dispute over a single river became a symbol of a larger imbalance. Canada felt its environmental security was being sacrificed for American profit. The US saw Canadian interference in its affairs. The standoff escalated, turning a local issue into an international crisis. The border closure was the culmination of this unresolved conflict. What started as a small-town dispute now threatened the stability of two nations. The flashpoint had become a firestorm. The world took notice. Canada's response was targeted and strategic. Instead of closing the entire border, they focused on routes essential for land access to Alaska, especially the Alaska Highway. New inspection points and strict policies allowed only essential, pre-approved commercial traffic. Private vehicles and US-bound trucks heading to Alaska were turned away. The official reason? Unresolved bilateral issues, with the Stewart-Hyder dispute front and center. The Stewart border crossing was closed to all but local residents, isolating Hyder and halting the mine project. Smaller crossings were also affected. Canada invoked national interest and security clauses to justify the move. The message was clear: respect our sovereignty or lose access. The border became a tool of leverage, not just a line on a map. Implementation was swift. Within hours, new protocols were in place. The disruption was immediate and widespread. Canada had built a regulatory wall, and it worked. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the crisis. In Hyder, Alaska, life ground to a halt. Residents were cut off from Stewart, their lifeline for groceries, school, and mail. Only medical emergencies were allowed to cross. The sense of community between the two towns was shattered overnight. Travelers heading to Alaska found their plans ruined, families stranded, RVs turned back, and campgrounds overwhelmed. Heartbreaking stories emerged, retirees on dream trips, families relocating, all upended by politics. Truck drivers lost their primary route, with goods stranded and contracts broken. Small business owners faced financial ruin as shipments stalled. The ripple effects hit the entire logistics industry serving Alaska. Alaskans braced for supply shortages and price hikes. Businesses worried about getting materials, grocery stores prepared for empty shelves. The psychological impact was profound. Alaskans felt isolated and vulnerable. The closure exposed how dependent they were on a foreign government for basic needs. The pain was immediate and personal. The border dispute was no longer abstract. It was a daily hardship. The human cost was undeniable. The crisis had real faces and real consequences. The closure sent shockwaves through Alaska's supply chains. The state relies on the lower 48 for goods, food, and products, most of it trucked up the Alaska Highway. With the land route gone, businesses scrambled for costly sea and air alternatives. Shipping costs soared, and prices for basics like milk and bread were set to spike. Small businesses faced closure. Families faced tighter budgets. The impact rippled South Washington. Farmers lost orders. Trucking companies laid off drivers, and Seattle's port was overwhelmed. The crisis exposed a fundamental vulnerability: Alaska's dependence on Canadian goodwill. Strategic planners questioned how to build more resilient supply chains. The cheap, easy land route had been taken for granted. Now its loss was a painful lesson. The economic reckoning was deep and far-reaching. In Washington, shock turned to outrage. The U.S. ambassador to Canada was recalled. Lawmakers demanded retaliation. The Secretary of State condemned Canada's actions as unjustified. Canada's Prime Minister stood firm, citing repeated U.S. refusals to address environmental concerns. He insisted the border would reopen only after a joint review of the mine. Diplomatic channels froze. Phone calls between leaders were tense and unproductive. The U.S. saw Canada's move as blackmail. Canada saw it as their only leverage. Trust eroded quickly, and joint initiatives stalled. Decades of partnership were suddenly in jeopardy. Officials who once worked as close colleagues now found themselves adversaries. The crisis was a stark reminder even the closest allies can clash when interests diverge. Geography, once a symbol of friendship, had become a weapon. The path to reconciliation looked long and uncertain. The world watched as the deep freeze set in. Former President Trump took the border closure as a personal insult. He unleashed outrage on social media, attacking Canada's Prime Minister and demanding a boycott of Canadian goods. Trump's rhetoric inflamed his base, framing the crisis as American weakness and disrespect. He called for drastic retaliation, even suggesting a wall on the northern border. His intervention complicated diplomacy, making compromise politically risky for the current administration. The crisis became a partisan weapon, deepening divisions at home and abroad. Trump's fury raised the stakes, pushing both countries further apart. The path to resolution grew even more difficult. The world is watching as two close allies face a bitter standoff. The crisis highlights the fragility of international norms and the rise of nationalist interests. The future is uncertain. Escalation could lead to a damaging trade war, while back-channel diplomacy might offer a way out. Environmental issues have become central to national sovereignty, driving nations to take drastic measures. This green nationalism is reshaping global politics. The Alaska border crisis is a test of modern diplomacy. Can economic and environmental interests be balanced? The outcome will set a precedent for resolving cross-border disputes in an interconnected world. The choices made by Washington and Ottawa will have global consequences. The border, once a symbol of peace, now stands as a warning. The next steps will shape the future of international cooperation.